Okay, so the first theory of learning we're going to look at is a conditioning theory, and this is sometimes called an associationist or a connectionist theory or viewpoint. The particular one we're going to look at today is the theory of operant conditioning. Okay, and operant conditioning says that we learn to act in a certain way to a stimulus, so we give a particular response when we're faced with a stimulus. Now, we've got an SR bond, stimulus response bond. Okay, now if we've learnt a particular response well, then we would say that this bond between the stimulus and response is strong, and that means that it's more likely to be given to that stimulus. If we've got a weak stimulus response bond, then that would be the less likely response that we would give. Now, the implications of this are that if we've got an expert in basketball taking a shot, then they will have practiced a lot, so the response that they give, which would be strong and well practiced, would be the correct one. So their more likely response is to get the ball into the basket, whereas a beginner's strongest bond would probably be the incorrect response, and that means that the incorrect response is more likely to occur, and their strong response, their correct response, which would be to get the ball into the basket, has only got a weak bond, which means that it's less likely to occur. Okay, so the way in which we learn, according to operant conditioning theory, is pretty much dependent on whether we produce the correct response or not. And for the exam, we need to know 3 different forms of reinforcement. The first one is positive reinforcement. Okay, and the way this works is that we receive praise or reward for correct responses, and that strengthens that SR bond, so it motivates us, or motivates the performer to want to produce that response again. The second form of reinforcement is negative reinforcement, and that also strengthens the SR bond. Okay, so I'm just going to highlight that. It strengthens the SR bond, and it does that in this way. So what happens is we produce the incorrect response. If we produce an incorrect response, we receive criticism. And the way that negative reinforcement works is that we want to avoid getting that criticism again, so we try and perform the correct response. And when we perform the correct response, that criticism goes away. And that aspect, the criticism going away, reinforces or strengthens that SR bond. Okay, so just to recap, negative reinforcement and positive reinforcement, both of them seek to strengthen the SR bond. Okay, the last aspect is punishment. And that seeks to break or weaken the SR bond. Okay, and this isn't a particularly good way of learning, but an example might be that for producing the incorrect response, we have to run a lap, or you get a detention, or you may perform some sort of physical punishment. Okay, and that would weaken that SR bond, so we wouldn't want to perform that or produce that response again. Okay, so in the exam you may come across a question that looks something like the one that's written on the screen. Explain operant conditioning theory. Now, the way we go about that is the first thing I would do is give an example of how operant conditioning theory works. So you could say that we use rewards or praise, or you could remove criticism to encourage learning. Okay. The next thing we would say is that operant conditioning works on the basis of trial and error. So the performer is posed with a problem, and they then go and experiment with ways to solve that problem or produce a response to that stimulus. Now, the coach or the teacher would then strengthen the SR bond, and that's for giving a successful response. Okay, so the successful response is associated with the stimulus. The next thing that would get us a mark would be we use positive or negative reinforcement to strengthen that bond. And the final thing that you could mention is that we shape behaviour. We shape behaviour. So the action that's closer to the desired action we would reinforce or reward, and if it's further from the desired action you would use negative reinforcement. So correct, we would reward or positive, and if it's incorrect we would use negative reinforcement or criticise. Okay, another question that you might come across is something like, how can a coach use operant conditioning to develop skills? And there's lots of different points you could make on this, so we're just going to run through a few of them. The first one would be to use rewards or praise. Okay, the next thing that they might be able to do is to shape behaviour or alter the environment. Okay, and they would do that by use of targets, or specialist equipment, and we're trying to allow success. Okay, because that success is then going to increase motivation. It's also going to strengthen that SR bond. We can use negative reinforcement, which is, you get a mark for saying what that is. So we remove criticism when the correct response is given. Okay, we could, although it's not advisable, we could use punishment as well, and that's going to decrease the likelihood of that response being given again. Okay, the final question you may come across in the exam is something to do with the criticisms or the drawbacks of operant conditioning as a theory of learning. The first thing that I would write down here is that operant conditioning, due to the nature of trial and error, the learner lacks understanding. If they're just asked to produce a response, they don't actually understand why they need to produce that response, and that can be demotivating for them. Excuse me. Okay, the next point would be that trial and error, or this trial and error way of learning, the performer could develop the wrong technique. So if we're focused on outcomes, such as getting the ball into the basket or serving the shuttlecock into the service area, then if it goes in there, then we get rewarded for that, or we get praised for that. However, it may be that we're using the wrong technique, and that will require unlearning, and that wastes time. Okay, due to the fact that we lack understanding, or the learner lacks understanding, it then means that we may not be able to respond to new stimuli. So if you're faced with a new situation in a game, it means that we're not well equipped because we don't understand and we can't change our responses. It means that we may not be well equipped to deal with that new situation. The next point that I would make is that if there was an SR bond for every skill, there's a hell of a lot of links that need to be stored in our memory. Okay, so there is a storage issue. So that seems like an unlikely way that we would store information. And the final point to note is that beginners don't respond well to criticism. They don't respond well to criticism or punishment, so that should be avoided. And it seems like an unlikely way to explain how we learn. Okay, that's the video on operant conditioning. Good luck in the exam.